Sunday, June 25th, 1950. It was business as usual in the United States Far East Air Force headquarters in Tokyo. The weather was fine, except the monsoon season was starting, and with it, muggy heat and scattered showers, followed later in the week by a Siberian cold front that brought heavier rains and low clouds, though this would mostly affect nearby Korea. Despite the knowledge fresh in many American minds that the attack on Pearl Harbor, less than 10 years earlier, had happened early on a Sunday, peacetime schedules prevailed, and Sunday was not a duty day. Many of the senior Air Force staff were out on leave. Up in Pyongyang, the North Koreans were also watching the weather. For the last several years, Kim Il-sung had been busy lobbying the Soviets and the Chinese to provide support for his army. Just 2 days prior, on June 23rd, United Nations observers had paid a visit to the 38th parallel. They did not find any reason to believe war was imminent. At 4 a.m. on June 25th, a North Korean assault shattered the border guard of the 38th parallel. A column of tanks spearheaded the assault under artillery cover. Overhead, a flight of Yak-9s headed to Seoul to destroy the South's Air Force before it got off the ground. Back in Japan, there was debate among the Americans on how to respond. Border skirmishes were not uncommon on the 38th parallel. But shortly after midnight, American surveillance aircraft revealed that there was a full-scale invasion underway. Intelligence reported that Kim Il-sung had made an announcement. The South had provoked the attack, and his forces were en route to Seoul to arrest and execute the bandit traitor Syngman Rhee. The entire U.S. Pacific Fleet was scrambled, foregoing the typical United Nations resolution. Strafing runs would destroy 30% of South Korea's Air Force while still on the runway. Yak-9s and IL-10 bombers continued to provide air support for the North Korean advance. Kim Il-sung had only convinced his Soviet and Chinese backers to support his invasion, with the promise that a blitzkrieg-style assault would quickly pacify the South's government. The Americans would quickly intervene, organizing an evacuation of politicians and diplomats. Yaks and IL bombers harassed the transport planes, trying to cut off the retreat of South Korean leadership, but were greeted and quickly outmatched by American jet fighters. The North Koreans had based their entire strategy on UN forces not intervening. Had they failed to act, the outcome of the war may have been very different. At the dawn of the Korean War, the North Koreans' air force was 10 times the size of the South. But in perspective, the South Koreans only had 10 T-6 Texan trainer aircraft and 12 C-47 transport planes. The North Koreans had more planes than they had trained pilots, retaining over 200 surplus Soviet airframes, of at least 93 IL-10 bombers, 79 Yak-9 fighters, and some 50 transports and trainers. But out of 2,000 North Korean Air Force personnel, only 120 were pilots, and only 32 were combat qualified. The United Nations contingent was led by the United States, which hosted roughly 400 aircraft throughout Japan, Guam, and the Philippines. On hand in Japan were just shy of 100 F-80 Shooting Stars, 36 F-82 Twin Mustangs, 36 B-26 bombers, and 24 B-29s, and an assortment of transport and search and rescue aircraft. Korea had spent the last 35 years under Japanese imperial rule. Just months before the end of World War II, the Japanese were driven off the peninsula by Red Army forces from the north and American forces from the south. Similarly to Germany, the two occupiers met at an arbitrary point in the middle. This geographic line was so named, the 38th parallel. Kim Il-sung would return to his hometown in northern Korea in September of 1945. After 26 years of exile in Manchuria, he barely spoke Korean. He had spent decades leading anti-Japanese guerrilla forces under an early Chinese Communist Party, and served 3 years in the Soviet Red Army. Kim was a feverish communist and violently dedicated to reuniting Korea. South Korean President Syngman Rhee stood 37 years Kim's senior. Similarly to Kim, Rhee had spent his life in a constant cycle of anti-Japanese activities and subsequent exile. But Rhee had grown up on the grounds of an English-speaking Christian mission in Korea. His exile would be to America, and whether by outside influence or design, RAAF was pro-American and viciously anti-communist. Both men had remarkably similar missions: liberation and reunification of Korea, and as leaders, both were inexcusably violent dictators. But the communist nations trusted Kim, supplying him healthily with military equipment and a contingent of Soviet advisors. The Americans kept RAAF at arm's length. RAAF's administration was scarred by corruption and a bloody campaign against suspected communists in his own ranks. The Americans refused to provide him with heavy military equipment. President RAAF would escape the initial invasion and re-establish a temporary government in Busan, providing the next target for North Korean troops. By early July, the United Nations had authorized a police action to assist the South. Air interdiction into North Korea was authorized. Aircraft carriers stood ready off the coast, providing F-80 fighter escorts for the B-26 and B-29 bombing missions. Inexperienced North Korean pilots continued to sacrifice themselves against the jet fighters. North Korean land forces would push the United Nations to the gates of Busan in just 30 days, but in the process, the North Korean Air Force was decimated. UN air power was intensely bombing North Korean airfields, destroying most aircraft while still on the ground. Intelligence reports estimated the North Koreans were down to just 20 planes. B-29 carpet bombings and B-26 close air support ravaged the North Koreans and kept the army stalled outside of Busan until the United Nations could reinforce and counterattack. The North Korean supply lines were crippled by strategic bombings, allowing the UN to push all the way back to the 38th parallel by October 1st. The successful counterattack led to consultations between Beijing and Moscow over the future plans to aid North Korea. On October 1st, Kim Il-sung urged Mao Zedong to throw the weight of the Chinese army into the war. Mao agreed, on the conditions that the Soviets would also join in. For Joseph Stalin, however, the vigor of the UN response to the invasion came as an unpleasant surprise. Stalin had once promised Mao that the USSR would handle the air war, but by this time he had reconsidered. The Soviets were fearful of US strategic air power and wished to avoid giving a pretext for a nuclear attack on Russia. The offer was made to route through China a powerful new bomber interceptor, the MiG-15. Meanwhile, in the United States, General MacArthur and President Truman were also in talks. By late October, Pyongyang was sacked, and by October 25th, the Air Force was forced to suspend B-29 bombing missions because they had run out of targets. The war appeared nearly over, and Truman wanted assurances that the Chinese would not intervene. Intelligence reports detailed the troop buildup across the Yalu River, the natural land barrier that separates North Korea from China. MacArthur assured Truman that the Chinese would not intervene, and if they did, without air support, it would be of little consequence. There were already hints of Chinese intervention by November 1st. That evening, the communists would claim their first jet kill. The Chinese army appeared to rush across the border to face the UN advance. UN forces, spread thin to chase the retreating North Koreans, were suddenly encircled. MiG-15s, bearing North Korean Air Force insignia, began challenging UN air missions over the Chinese assault. MiGs claimed their first kill of an F-51 Mustang, quickly after an F-80 Shooting Star. Facing the Chinese intervention they had feared, MacArthur ordered B-29 bombing missions to resume at the Yalu River, hoping to stop the encirclement of his ground troops, but they seemed to have no effect. North Korean marked MiGs were intercepting B-29 missions out of air bases in China, while UN bombers were strictly prohibited from entering Chinese airspace. Cold War politics had already reared their ugly head. The US made thinly veiled threats to deploy nuclear weapons, but the communists called their bluff. The US didn't have a stockpile large enough for protracted use, and nuclear deployment would surely spark an expansion into full-scale war, pitting the United States against Russia and China. By November 26th, MiGs had already shot down 2 B-29s and damaged 2 more badly enough to force them to crash on return to base. The United States hurriedly assembled a fighter group of jets capable of taking on the MiGs. the F-86 Sabre. By the time the Sabres were deployed on December 15th, Communist forces had driven the UN forces all the way back to the 38th parallel. On their retreat, B-29s firebombed Pyongyang. The new year saw UN forces pushed even further behind the 38th, allowing North Koreans to recapture Seoul, making it the third exchange of the war. By this point, ground operations were exchanging the same hills on a daily basis, and the air war was heating up. Tens of MiGs had been shot down, along with tens of B-29s. United Nations strategies aimed to cut off supplies to the front line by concentrating on Yalu River bridge crossings. Low-flying missions were impossible as anti-air artillery was so dense in the region. For months, B-29 carpet bombings were unable to hit small bridges from 30,000 feet. By April of 1951, the UN contingent embarked on the largest bombing mission of the war. 46 B-29s, escorted by over 100 F-86s and F-80s, were deployed to destroy a single bridge. They were met over North Korean airspace by an entire wing of 100 MiGs. The MiGs concentrated their fire on the B-29s, shooting 3 out of the sky and crippling 7 others. For their efforts, 10 MiGs were lost. Suspicions of the origins of these MiGs went undeclared. While the MiGs bore North Korean and Chinese markings, intercepted radio communications revealed broken Korean, spoken with thick Russian accents. During the heat of battle, these communications frequently broke into their native tongue. Both Eastern and Western powers would contribute to this secrecy, hoping not to expand the conflict into World War III. The UN took advantage of the secrecy. Quickly dropping the formality of the Chinese border, pilots were allowed a hot pursuit policy to follow the MiGs deep into Chinese territory. Fighter aces on both sides were pinned nearly every month. The better-trained F-86 pilots exploited their airframe's role of fighter interceptor to down MiGs nearly every day. The anti-bomber MiGs exploited their heavier guns to severely damage the B-29s. While an average of only one B-29 was shot down every month, many were so badly damaged that they would later crash trying to return home. Political infighting had reached a boiling point at the United Nations. Since the Chinese intervention, American generals controlling UN forces had grown unruly. MacArthur had first suggested deployment of nuclear weapons to halt the Chinese advance, but in April, he would deploy aircraft carriers off the coast of mainland China, hoping to provoke an attack. In a political scandal, President Truman would relieve MacArthur of his command. Perhaps as a sign of things to come, 1 month later, the U.S. Air Force commander in charge of operations in Korea would die of a heart attack. By July of 1951, ground operations would remain in a virtual stalemate until the end of the war. Neither the North Koreans, supported by the Chinese, nor the UN, supported by the Americans, would exchange territory further than 7 miles from the 38th parallel. The latter half of 1951 and 1952 would be spent in vicious jet versus jet dogfights over an area called Mig Alley. Because most of North Korea lay in ruins, the majority of bombing missions would occur along the border with Manchuria. F-86 pilots would fly along the border at low speeds, imitating the radar signature of vulnerable bombers and scout aircraft, baiting out the MiGs. The Sabre pilots were greatly outnumbered in the air by MiGs, but despite this, they maintained the advantage. MiGs flew at a higher speed due to their design as bomber interceptors, but for this they sacrificed maneuverability. On occasion, the Sabres could take down MiGs without firing a shot, tailing them and forcing them to take evasive actions so severe that the MiGs went into an uncontrollable spin and crashed. By the end of 1952, the war in the air also came to stalemate, with UN bombings making no real progress at cutting supply lines, and MiG pilots making no progress at regaining North Korean airspace. March 5th, 1953. Good weather has permitted UN pilots to fly 700 sorties in a single day. For their efforts, they would destroy 14 tents and 10 supply stacks on the Manchurian border. America has pinned its 28th fighter ace of the war, Captain Manuel Fernandez. North Korean leader Kim Il-sung and South Korean President Syngman Rhee have not had a say in their country's affairs since the war broke out, having been taken over by greater powers. President Truman's presidential term has ended, and Eisenhower was elected. A news report broadcasts over the radio. The leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, has died of a heart attack. China's Mao Zedong signals to the UN coalition that peace treaties were back on the table. For 3 years of fighting, over 1 million soldiers and as many as 5 million civilians lie dead. Both sides are stalemated within 5 miles of where they started, at the 38th parallel. The final ceasefire would be signed on July 27th. That afternoon, the last aircraft of the war is shot out of the sky, a North Korean propeller plane, pinning America's 41st ace of the war. The war never officially ended, and to this day, despite the end of fighting, still continues on paper. In the end, the Soviet Union would collapse before admitting their involvement, after which Soviet pilots would give their personal testimony, claiming 679 Sabres and nearly 400 bombers to 659 MiGs lost. But the Americans would only admit to Sabres and bombers totaling 139, claiming 792 MiGs. Some call the Korean War the Forgotten War, but I assure you, to the men and women who witnessed it, it is still very much not forgotten.